This is my final presentation for our paper, and it is an analysis of environmental health risk assessments on cadmium exposure from rice consumption in Japan. So a bit of background on cadmium. This is a natural element, and it is found in our air, water, soil, and food. And then it can also be extracted during the production of other metals. So think when you're mining. Cadmium has an extremely long half-life, up to 38 years, and it will tend to concentrate in the lungs, liver, and kidneys. We have two primary exposure routes for cadmium. The first is going to be inhalation. So cigarette smoke, specifically because the tobacco plant has a tendency to take up cadmium from the soil, and then also occupational fumes. And then for ingestion, we are looking at polluted foods such as rice, which is what we'll be doing today. And then cadmium has been classified as a group B1 probable human carcinogen by the EPA, and then a group 1 known human carcinogen by the IARC. So Itai-Itai disease was the inspiration for this paper. Itai-Itai translates to hurts disease, and it is the most severe form of chronic cadmium poisoning. It was first identified in the Jinzu River Basin in Japan, and that area is known to have a significant amount of cadmium pollution. And the way it works is cadmium will collect in your kidneys, leading to renal dysfunction, and then you'll have an insufficient amount of vitamin D, leading to osteomalacia and osteoporosis, which is the softening of bones and then actually the loss of bone density. And then those two together will change your actual bone structure. And that is what you were seeing in the picture off to the side. Very characteristic of this disease is the hunching of the back. So our problem, or the problem statement for this paper, rice is a staple in the Japanese diet. They will eat it with nearly every meal. And if you're not eating rice with your meal, you're eating a secondary food that probably contains rice. So think about rice noodles, think about sake, or even seasonings and sauces like rice vinegar. There is government oversight for cadmium exposure in rice. That's specifically for rice on the market because they know this is an issue. However, a lot of farmers are going to be eating locally harvested rice that will not have this type of oversight. When we're talking about bioaccumulation, our concern is going to be for those older farmers. And then we also need to remember that nothing happens in a vacuum. While rice can be contaminated with cadmium, it can also be contaminated with a lot of heavy metals. So lead and arsenic are two great examples. And East Asia, which includes Japan, is actually known to have high levels of both arsenic and cadmium in rice. So the purpose of this paper was to investigate cadmium exposure levels from the consumption of rice in Japan. So the way this is going to go is I'm just going to take you through a couple of the pieces of literature that I looked at for this paper. We're going to talk through their methods, talk about what they found, and then how that contributes to the wider overall picture of this paper. So the first study came out in 2018. It was by Wang et al. And they used the total diet study, which looks at compositions of food, to assess cadmium dietary exposure to adults. And the study was conducted specifically in China. So they had 662 adults across 244 households. They had 3 days worth of food record questionnaires. And then based on those questionnaires, went and collected samples from local markets or stores, and then did cook them according to local practices. Representative foods were chosen that had either extremely high cadmium levels that were known, or that people were consuming in high quantities, so at least over 5%. Based on those, they had 76 food samples among 13 different food groups, and this covered 99% of their food intake, so it was considered to be a pretty good sample group. Chemical analysis was according to the Chinese national standard, and they did estimate the contribution of each food group based on a 2008 food consumption survey. So what they found was that the most, or the food group that was being consumed at the highest rate were vegetables, and then fruits, rice, dairy, and meat. And then those groups that had the highest cadmium concentrations were tumors, and then legumes and nuts, rice, and vegetables. Notably, the mean dietary exposure of cadmium was found to be lower than the standard. One of the reasons I wanted to start with this is because there were a couple of uncertainties. So the first is that because the study was conducted in China, the chances of their diets being different is very likely, and Japanese individuals will likely be eating more rice. And then also that food consumption data was about 9 years old and could be outdated, affecting their study results. So we know that there are acceptable levels of cadmium in China, so let's look at Japan. So in 2018, Nagwa et al. Conducted a study where they looked at the lifetime cadmium intake calculating from birth up to the time of data collection. And this was used to look at their lifetime mortality as well as their internal exposures. They had over 7,000 individuals from the Jinsu River Basin. So this is that area in Japan that was where Itai-Itai disease was first identified. And they had a 26-year follow-up with about a third of their individuals. Adjustments were made for age, smoking status, and hypertension, all of which could have been confounders. And they used family records to calculate person years for all of the individuals. Statistical analyses were run using a p-value of 0.05. So they found that men had higher mortality and higher lifetime cadmium doses, but women were having more frequent side effects, I suppose is the correct term. So they were having more kidney and urinary tract diseases, more renal diseases, and more renal failure. And they also did identify a dose-response relationship with the lifetime cadmium dose and mortality of all causes in that same area. So this study brought up the question of gender. Why were women, even though they were eating or being exposed to less, having more of these other issues? So they had two potential explanations. The first being that women tend to have lower blood pressure, which could have resulted in lower mortality rates for other various diseases. And then the second is that women will have low iron storage, which can be related to a greater cadmium intake within the gastrointestinal tract. So we know that women are being affected more greatly, are being more greatly affected. So does age play a role in that? Well, Horichi in 2013 looked at this. So they conducted a cross-sectional study on female farmers between the ages of 40 and 79. The area was known to be polluted with cadmium from mines and various smelting plants, and they had a self-administered questionnaire to look at their diet history, their where the rice that they were eating was coming from, their place of residence, etc. And then they did age match their control population with their experimental. So this is getting at what I mentioned earlier, which is that the farmers are a vulnerable population because they're not benefiting from the government oversight of cadmium and are more likely to be exposed. So what they found is that there was a relationship between cadmium exposure and renal effects, and that was affected by age. So younger individuals were not having significant effects. And then by the time you hit 70, 79, you were having distinct effects. And this plays into cadmium's long half-life, which can be up to 38, 39 years. So thinking about how long these people have been exposed, these effects might just be showing up. All right, so what can the farmers do? Well, Yang et al. In 2021 looked at this. So their study was asking specifically in terms of soil, what changes could be made. So they were looking at the pH as well as redox reactions. And this was based on a belief that as pH increases or becomes more basic, the cadmium availability would decrease in the soil. So they looked at 3 different rice varieties in China, the top 2 being known to have low cadmium accumulation, and then the third is a local variety. And then they looked at 2 water management techniques, the first being your conventional irrigation, and then the second being aerobic treatment. So they were trying to keep the rice paddy as dry as possible and not flood it with water. So what they found is that for all three of them, only the local variety had a hazard quotient over 1, which we know would produce adverse effects. And that the aerobic management, so again, keeping that paddy dry and without water, actually decreased the available cadmium in the soil. However, bringing up, like I said, that nothing happens in a vacuum, it also increased the arsenic. So weigh your options. And then a slight piece that they did note is that the soil concentration of cadmium was not necessarily correlated with the grain concentration. So even though this is helpful to know, more research needs to be done to play into the actual exposure. And then one of their uncertainties is irregular rainfall. So aerobic management meant keeping the rice paddy as dry as possible. When it rains, you can't always control that. So what can people do on the individual side? Well, Sharifi et al. In 2019 looked at this. So most of the studies on cadmium exposure among rice looks at raw rice, and that's just not representative of the way we prepare it, because we don't eat rice when it's raw. So they looked at 6 different preparation processes and 2 different cooking methods. And specifically those 2 cooking methods, a rinsed method is when you have more water than rice, swish it around, and then drain that water. And the kate or conventional method is when you have rice, water, and then that's just how you cook it. So they had 250 rice samples. Of those, they chose the 30 that had the highest frequency, and then took 30 from each. So they had a total of 90 samples. And then they did analyze this according to the American Society for Testing Materials and their processes. What they found was that people were consuming primarily the Iranian brand of rice. They were also cooking it according to the conventional method, which is not rinsing, and that most people were not soaking their rice, they were simply washing it. There was a significant difference in efficiency based on the processes that you used, but all of them were significant except for that conventional method. So what they decided, or what they presented, was that the best option was to wash your rice and then soak it for 5 to 12 hours. Ideally 12, but they recognize that most people are not going to do that. So 5 was also comparable. And then cook your rice using the rinse method. So this is the best option because A, when you soaked your rice, that water could permeate further into the actual rice grain. And then also once that has happened and it's in the water, you dump the water. So you're not just taking cadmium out of the rice into water and then boiling it and putting it right back in. So coming back to this and also looking at it in terms of conclusions, what we found is that the Japanese diet is putting individuals at an increased exposure risk because of their consumption of rice, but not necessarily all of Japanese individuals, or not necessarily all of people eating rice. Our vulnerable population is among rice farmers eating their own rice that is not getting that government oversight, among women, especially in terms of different types of diseases or offshoots or negative side effects, and older aged individuals because of bioaccumulation. And then that through a combination of farming practices and preparation methods, so both on the side of the farmers and on the individual who's cooking that rice, there are ways to reduce your cadmium exposure and be more protective. So these are my not exposures, references, and thank you very much.